So this is your husband?
He fixes problems.
Sir, welcome. Excuse me. I need to see someone. You still carry that notebook?
It still works.
Then we should talk, boss.
Christopher Hernandez was 42, a quiet, independent facilities consultant who looked more like a maintenance contractor than a man trusted by Fortune 500 boardrooms. Around him, people assumed he earned an ordinary living because he drove an aging Ford F-150, wore the same faded navy jacket every winter, and still carried a weathered leather notebook instead of an expensive laptop. What nobody inside Redwood Nexus Technologies' executive leadership gala knew was that Christopher had quietly rescued billion-dollar companies while signing away every ounce of public credit. Then Abigail laughed, lifted her champagne glass, and said, "Please, don't mistake him for one of our executives." The ballroom fell silent as the newly appointed CEO walked through the doors and headed straight toward Christopher. If you're watching from somewhere in the world today, let me know your country and your local time in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where these stories are reaching. And if you enjoy slow-burning stories filled with hidden truths, unexpected justice, and unforgettable twists, consider subscribing now. Tomorrow's story may remind you that the quietest person in the room is often the one everyone should have noticed. 6 years earlier, before expensive business dinners and executive retreats began filling Abigail Morgan Hernandez's calendar, life had moved at a much quieter pace. Christopher Hernandez liked those years. Their house stood on a narrow street in Naperville, Illinois, 28 miles west of downtown Chicago. It wasn't large, just a 2-story brick home with white shutters, a maple tree that covered the driveway every October, and a front porch where Christopher drank coffee every morning before sunrise. He woke at 5. Every day. Not because anyone demanded it, because silence helped him think. Long before the neighborhood lights came on, he would sit outside wearing an old gray sweatshirt, a ceramic mug warming both hands, while a yellow legal pad rested across his knees. Neighbors assumed he was planning maintenance jobs. Most mornings he was restructuring companies worth billions of dollars. No one ever knew. Christopher preferred it that way. Years earlier, he had been one of the youngest senior operations strategists at Hamilton and Pierce Consulting, one of Chicago's most respected advisory firms. The promotions came quickly. So did the flights. Seattle on Monday, Dallas on Wednesday, Atlanta by Friday, sometimes 3 cities in 4 days. Corporate jets, luxury hotels, board meetings beginning before sunrise and ending close to midnight. Clients admired him because he solved problems other consultants could barely explain. Factories missing production targets, distribution centers losing millions, healthcare systems collapsing under inefficient operations. Christopher rarely spoke first. He listened. He walked factory floors. He watched employees instead of executives. He carried his notebook everywhere. Inside were observations, not opinions. He believed numbers always revealed the truth if someone had enough patience to find them. By 36, he was making more money than he had ever imagined growing up. Yet he looked exhausted. One winter evening, Abigail found him asleep in their garage, still sitting inside his truck, laptop open, engine off. He had come home nearly an hour earlier, but had been too tired to walk into the house. That image stayed with her. 3 months later, Christopher resigned. His managing partner tried everything: more vacation, a larger bonus, a partnership track, even fewer travel requirements. Christopher thanked him for every offer, then politely declined them all. Money was never the reason he started working. He wasn't going to let it become the reason he stayed. Instead, he opened a consulting practice unlike any firm his former colleagues had ever seen. No downtown office, no receptionist, no advertisements, no company website, no social media, no interviews, no marketing. His clients came only through personal referrals. If one CEO trusted Christopher enough to recommend him, another would eventually call. Every engagement began with the same agreement: Absolute confidentiality, non-disclosure agreements that protected everyone involved. If Christopher solved a crisis, the company received the credit. He disappeared. He insisted on it. The arrangement confused almost everyone. His accountant once asked, "Do you realize you could charge twice as much if people actually knew what you've accomplished?" Christopher smiled. "I already have enough." That answer frustrated people who measured success by visibility. It made perfect sense to Christopher. Abigail admired him then. She often told friends that her husband had never cared about titles. "He sleeps better than any executive I know," she once joked during a neighborhood barbecue. "And he actually eats dinner at home." Back then she laughed because she was proud. Life felt balanced. Christopher cooked almost every Sunday. His specialty was smoked brisket. Neighbors could smell it from 2 houses away. He repaired things himself, changed the oil in the truck, fixed the fence after spring storms, helped elderly neighbors shovel snow without being asked. Nothing about him suggested extraordinary success. Everything about him suggested reliability. Those qualities mattered to Abigail. At least they used to. Her own career accelerated almost unexpectedly. Redwood Nexus Technologies had hired her as a marketing manager shortly after Christopher left Hamilton and Pierce. She was talented, confident, creative. She understood branding better than most people twice her age. Within 2 years, she became director. Less than 18 months later, she was promoted again. Senior Director of Marketing. The raises arrived, then stock options, business class flights, executive networking events, industry conferences in Las Vegas, San Francisco, Boston, and Miami. Her professional circle changed. So did the conversations. At first, Christopher barely noticed. She came home excited. She told stories about presentations, product launches, quarterly targets, leadership workshops. Christopher listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, celebrated every promotion with flowers instead of expensive gifts. He believed achievements deserved attention, not price tags. Then small changes appeared. They arrived quietly, almost invisibly. At dinner parties, conversations began revolving around luxury neighborhoods, private schools, vacation homes, European watches, new Teslas, investment portfolios. Nobody spoke directly about money. They simply compared lifestyles until comparisons became competition. Christopher remained exactly the same. The same truck, the same jacket, the same work boots, the same grocery store, the same coffee from the gas station near Interstate 88, because as he always said, "It tastes fine." Abigail began noticing how different he looked beside corporate husbands. Most wore tailored suits, luxury watches, Italian leather shoes. Some introduced themselves by listing companies they'd acquired. Christopher introduced himself with a handshake and one sentence. "I'm Christopher. Nice to meet you." Nothing more. No resume, no performance. One evening, after another executive dinner, Abigail sat quietly in the passenger seat as Christopher drove home. Rain tapped softly against the windshield. Streetlights reflected across wet pavement. She watched another couple climb into a black Mercedes beside them at a traffic light. The husband wore a navy cashmere overcoat, perfect haircut, polished shoes. Without realizing it, she sighed. Christopher noticed. He always noticed. "What?" "Nothing." He nodded once. He didn't press. Days later, she stood inside their bedroom holding one of his jackets. "You really should buy something newer." Christopher looked up from his notebook. "This one still works?" "It looks old." "It is old." She forced a smile. "You can afford better." "I know." He returned to writing. The conversation ended there, but something had shifted. It wasn't about the jacket. It never had been. Over the following months, Abigail made similar suggestions. Maybe trade in the truck. Maybe buy nicer shoes. Maybe wear designer glasses. Maybe let a stylist choose new clothes. Christopher never argued. He simply answered with quiet honesty. I don't want people trusting me because of what I wear. She laughed awkwardly. That's not how the business world works. Christopher closed his notebook. It should be. The narrator could see something Christopher himself barely admitted. He wasn't disappointed because Abigail wanted him to dress differently. He was concerned because she had stopped asking why he chose simplicity. Curiosity had slowly been replaced by comparison. Comparison quietly became embarrassment. Christopher couldn't identify the exact day it happened. No marriage ever breaks in a single afternoon. Distance grows in inches. One conversation, one silence, one overlooked kindness at a time. Late one Friday afternoon, Abigail walked through the front door, carrying a heavy, cream-colored envelope, embossed with silver lettering. She smiled. This is the biggest event Redwood has ever hosted. Christopher looked up from the dining table, where he was reviewing handwritten notes. She opened the envelope carefully. Inside lay 2 invitations. Executive Leadership Gala. The Palmer House Hilton, downtown Chicago. Formal attire required. Spouses welcome. Christopher studied the elegant invitation for several seconds before folding it closed again. Then he noticed something else. Abigail wasn't smiling because she wanted to spend the evening with him. She was already worrying about how he would look when everyone else did. Christopher looked at the invitation one more time before sliding it back into its envelope. The paper alone probably cost more than an ordinary greeting card. Heavy cotton stock, silver embossed lettering, the Redwood Nexus Technologies logo pressed neatly into the lower corner. Everything about it communicated importance. Christopher placed it on the dining table and reached for his coffee. You don't seem excited, Abigail said. He smiled faintly. I'll be happy to spend the evening with you. That's not what I meant. I know. She leaned against the kitchen island, folding her arms. This isn't just another dinner. I figured. There will be board members. Christopher nodded. Investors. Another nod. The new CEO. I saw. She hesitated, then finally asked the question that had been growing inside her since the invitation arrived. What are you planning to wear? Christopher looked down at his coffee before answering. My charcoal suit. Abigail blinked. The one from Daniel's wedding? Christopher laughed softly. I've only got one charcoal suit. It was 8 years ago. I've had it tailored twice. Christopher. It still fits. She looked away. That's exactly the problem. Silence settled across the kitchen. Christopher wasn't offended. He simply watched her. The narrator noticed something Christopher himself rarely admitted. Whenever Abigail became uncomfortable, she cleaned. She straightened already straight chairs, adjusted perfectly aligned magazines, wiped spotless countertops. She wasn't cleaning, she was avoiding his eyes. We can buy another one, she finally said. We don't need to. We absolutely do. No, she sighed. Please. Christopher leaned back. Why? Because appearances matter. They've always mattered. No, he smiled gently. They've always existed. She shook her head. You know exactly what I mean. I probably do. Abigail walked closer. I don't want people making assumptions. Christopher answered without hesitation. They're going to make assumptions anyway. She frowned. They don't have to make those assumptions because of your clothes. Christopher's expression remained calm. If someone decides who I am because of a jacket, the jacket isn't the real issue. That answer frustrated her. It always did, because Christopher never argued emotionally. He simply exposed the center of the question. Abigail looked toward the window. Outside, Christopher's aging blue Ford F-150 sat in the driveway beneath the maple tree. The truck had nearly 200,000 miles. There were scratches near the tailgate, a small dent above the rear wheel. Christopher had repaired almost everything himself over the years. She suddenly imagined that truck pulling into the valet entrance of the Palmer House Hilton. Luxury sedans, German SUVs, Italian sports cars. Then Christopher's pickup. The image made her stomach tighten. What about renting something? Christopher looked genuinely confused. A truck? A car? Why? Just for one evening? My truck works. Christopher. It starts every morning. She laughed without humor. That's not the point. It usually isn't. She rubbed her forehead. You always do this. Do what? You answer everything literally. Christopher smiled. I answer honestly. For several seconds, neither spoke. Finally, Abigail sat across from him. I've worked really hard to get where I am. I know. You know how competitive Redwood is. I do. You know executives notice everything. Christopher nodded. They notice performance. They notice everything. She emphasized each word carefully. The shoes. The watches. The spouses. Christopher quietly absorbed that sentence, not because it surprised him, because it confirmed something he had been noticing for months. The conversation wasn't about him, it was about what other people might think. He reached across the table and gently touched her hand. I've always been proud of you. She looked at him. I know. I'll always support your career. I know. But I won't pretend to be someone else for strangers. Her eyes lowered. Christopher released her hand. The discussion ended without resolution. Over the following weeks, the subject returned repeatedly, sometimes over breakfast, sometimes while watching television, sometimes while driving. Each conversation followed almost the same pattern, Abigail suggested. Christopher declined. Neither raised their voice. Yet the distance between them quietly expanded. One Saturday afternoon, Abigail convinced him to visit Oakbrook Center Mall. She claimed she wanted to browse. Christopher knew better. Within 20 minutes, she guided him inside an upscale menswear boutique. Sales associates greeted them immediately. One young salesman smiled brightly. Looking for something special today? My husband needs a tuxedo, Abigail answered before Christopher spoke. Christopher smiled politely. I don't. The salesman laughed. Most husbands say that. He disappeared briefly before returning with 3 designer tuxedos, Italian wool, hand-finished lapels. Prices began around $4,000. Christopher examined the stitching with genuine appreciation. They're beautifully made. The salesman smiled. They certainly are. Christopher folded the jacket carefully and returned it. I don't need one. Abigail forced another smile. Could you at least try one? Christopher looked at her. If trying it on will make you happy. It took less than 10 minutes. The tuxedo fit perfectly. The salesman admired the reflection. You look like a Fortune 100 CEO. Christopher stared at himself, then quietly asked one question. Would I solve problems better wearing this? The salesman laughed uncertainly. Abigail did not. Christopher changed back into his old clothes. Outside the store, Abigail walked several steps ahead. Christopher eventually caught up. I'm sorry. She didn't answer. I know you meant well. She stopped walking. No. People flowed around them carrying shopping bags. Children laughed near the fountain. Somewhere nearby, a violinist played quietly. Abigail turned toward him. You don't understand. Help me? She hesitated, then spoke more honestly than she had in weeks. I'm tired of being the only person who looks like they belong. Christopher didn't respond immediately. The words settled heavily between them. Finally, he asked softly, So you think I don't belong? No. You just said you feel like the only one. I meant, She couldn't finish. Christopher rescued her from the sentence she wished she hadn't started. "I know what you meant." His voice remained kind, which somehow hurt even more. They drove home mostly in silence. Christopher's hands rested loosely on the steering wheel. He watched traffic move along Interstate 88 while Abigail stared through the passenger window. Neither noticed the dark SUV following them for nearly 20 minutes. When Christopher stopped for gas, the SUV continued toward Chicago. Inside sat a middle-aged executive speaking through a Bluetooth headset. "No," the man said. "I'm positive." He glanced once in the rearview mirror. That was Christopher Hernandez. A pause. "No doubt." Another pause. "I don't know why he's driving an old pickup either." The executive smiled. "But if Christopher Hernandez is attending Redwood's gala," he paused again, "someone is about to have a very surprising evening." Christopher never knew the conversation happened. He finished pumping gas, bought his usual coffee inside the convenience store, paid exactly $2.19, thanked the cashier by name because he stopped there almost every week, then drove home exactly as he always did. The following Monday morning, Abigail arrived early at Redwood headquarters in Chicago. Glass walls reflected the sunrise over the Chicago River. Employees hurried through security carrying laptops and coffee. The Executive Leadership Gala had become the main topic across every department. Guest lists, seating charts, the arrival of the company's newly appointed CEO. Everyone speculated. Inside the executive conference room, Abigail found Vice President of Corporate Strategy Ethan Brooks already pouring himself coffee. Ethan was 43, confident, impeccably dressed. The kind of executive who seemed to practice every smile before using it. He noticed Abigail immediately. "So," he said with an easy grin, "big night coming?" "It should be." "You bringing your husband?" Abigail forced a polite smile. "Of course. I've been meaning to meet him." She nodded. Ethan leaned casually against the counter. "I hope he enjoys networking." Christopher would have recognized the tone instantly, not curiosity, evaluation. Abigail heard it too, but instead of defending her husband immediately, she hesitated for just a fraction of a second. That hesitation told Ethan everything he needed to know. He smiled a little wider. "I'm looking forward to meeting him." Later that afternoon, while reviewing the digital gala program, Christopher happened to glance over Abigail's shoulder. Most of the names meant nothing to him. Then one stopped him. Nathaniel Grant, Chief Executive Officer. Christopher's eyes remained fixed on the screen several seconds longer than usual. His breathing never changed. Neither did his expression. Only one small detail betrayed recognition. His thumb slowly stopped turning the worn pages of the leather notebook resting in his lap. The Palmer House Hilton had hosted President's Governor's Fortune 500 celebrations and charity galas for more than a century. On the evening of Redwood Nexus, technology's Executive Leadership Gala, its grand ballroom looked less like a hotel venue and more like the headquarters of corporate success. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across polished marble floors. Live jazz drifted through the lobby. Valets opened doors for a steady procession of luxury vehicles, black Escalades, Mercedes S-Class sedans, Porsche Panameras, Tesla Model X Plaids. Executives stepped out wearing tailored tuxedos and designer gowns as photographers quietly captured arrivals for the company's internal publications. Then Christopher Hernandez parked his aging blue Ford F-150 in the self-parking garage 3 blocks away. He had refused valet service, not because he couldn't afford it, because he preferred walking. The cool October air rolled through downtown Chicago as he and Abigail crossed Monroe Street together. Christopher wore the same charcoal suit, pressed neatly, perfectly clean. His black leather shoes had been polished that afternoon in his garage. His tie was plain navy, no designer label, no expensive watch, only his wedding ring and the worn leather notebook tucked inside his jacket pocket. Abigail walked beside him in an elegant emerald evening gown. Her hair was carefully styled. Diamond earrings reflected the city lights. People turned to admire her. Christopher noticed. He smiled quietly. "You look beautiful." She thanked him, but her eyes had already moved toward the hotel entrance. The first thing she noticed was another executive couple arriving in front of them. The husband wore a custom tuxedo that probably cost more than Christopher's truck payment for several months. Abigail unconsciously glanced toward Christopher. He looked exactly as he always did, calm, comfortable, completely unaware of the silent comparisons happening around him. Inside the hotel lobby, Redwood employees gathered near registration tables. Large digital displays welcomed guests. "Welcome to the Redwood Nexus Executive Leadership Gala." A smiling event coordinator checked invitations. "Good evening." Christopher handed over theirs. The coordinator scanned the invitation. "Welcome, Miss Morgan Hernandez. Mr. Hernandez." She handed each of them a name badge. Abigail looked at Christopher's. Only his name appeared. Christopher Hernandez. No title, no company, no credentials. Exactly as he preferred. A moment later, several marketing managers approached Abigail. "Abby?" She turned immediately, laughing, hugging, introducing herself to arriving coworkers. Christopher stepped slightly backward to give them space. Nobody noticed. The narrator observed what Christopher always did in crowded rooms. He never competed for attention. If someone needed the spotlight, he quietly moved aside. Within 5 minutes, Abigail had become absorbed in conversation. Without realizing it, she slowly drifted away from him. 10 feet, then 20, then across the ballroom. Christopher remained standing alone near one of the marble columns. He wasn't uncomfortable. He simply watched. Years of consulting had taught him something unusual. Buildings always revealed the people inside them. He studied details automatically. Emergency exits, service corridors, kitchen traffic, security positions, employee movement. Nothing escaped his attention. Nearby, a young waiter carrying a silver tray accidentally collided with another server. Champagne glasses rattled violently. One slipped free. Christopher caught it before it shattered. The waiter stared at him. "Thank you, sir." Christopher smiled. "No problem." He handed back the glass and continued walking. Nobody applauded. Nobody even noticed. Across the room, Abigail was introducing herself to another vice president. Christopher preferred it that way. Minutes later, an elderly board member slowly approached the buffet carrying a cane. Someone bumped into him from behind. His dinner plate slipped sideways. Christopher reached him before it struck the floor. "I've got it." The elderly gentleman steadied himself. "Thank you." Christopher balanced both the cane and the plate with practiced ease. "You all right?" "I am now." The older man looked closely at Christopher's face. His smile faded slightly. For 2 or 3 seconds, he seemed to search his memory. "Have we—" Before he could finish, another executive interrupted. "Mr. Whitmore, the board is looking for you." The elderly director glanced back toward Christopher one final time. "I'm sorry. I thought—" Christopher nodded politely. "It happens." The director walked away, still looking puzzled. Christopher watched him disappear into the crowd. Nothing more. At the opposite side of the ballroom, Abigail noticed the interaction. Her stomach tightened. Why had Harold Whitmore, one of Redwood's longest-serving board directors, stopped to speak with Christopher? She dismissed the thought immediately. Coincidence. It had to be. A familiar voice interrupted her. "Well, Ethan Brooks smiled as he approached carrying 2 glasses of champagne. "So this is your husband?" Christopher extended his hand. "Christopher Hernandez." Ethan accepted the handshake. His grip was firm, slightly too firm, the kind some executives mistook for confidence. "It's nice finally meeting you." "You too." Ethan looked Christopher up and down almost invisibly, not enough to appear rude, enough to evaluate. "So what line of work are you in?" Christopher answered simply. "I consult." "What kind?" "Operations." Ethan waited. Christopher said nothing else. Ethan laughed lightly. "That's pretty broad." "It usually needs to be." Another executive standing nearby smiled politely, but seemed confused. Ethan continued. "Who do you consult for?" Christopher took a sip of sparkling water. "Different companies?" "Anything we'd recognize?" Christopher hesitated only because confidentiality mattered. "Some," Ethan chuckled. "I suppose consulting is one of those jobs where everyone can sound mysterious." Christopher smiled. "It can." Abigail forced a laugh. "He doesn't like talking about work." Christopher glanced toward her. She avoided his eyes. Ethan nodded knowingly. "I've met consultants like that." He hadn't, not like Christopher, but he assumed he had. Several more executives joined the conversation. Most introduced themselves only to Abigail. Christopher stood slightly outside the circle, listening, observing, not interrupting. One woman glanced toward Christopher. "Do you work with Redwood?" Before Christopher could answer, Abigail spoke first. "No." She smiled quickly. "He mostly works with smaller businesses." Christopher looked at her. He didn't correct her. The statement wasn't entirely true, nor entirely false. Another vice president asked Christopher, "So are you thinking about joining a larger consulting firm someday?" Christopher answered calmly. "I enjoy the work I have." Ethan laughed again. "That's a diplomatic way of saying no." Christopher nodded once. "It is." The group laughed politely, not because Christopher had made a joke, because they assumed he didn't understand theirs. Across the ballroom, another guest entered quietly through a side entrance, a tall woman in her 60s wearing a navy evening gown. Margaret Sullivan, outside counsel for Redwood's board of directors. She had attended nearly every board meeting for 15 years. While greeting several directors, her eyes briefly crossed the room. She froze, just for an instant, then looked again. Christopher had already turned away to help an elderly couple locate their assigned table. Margaret narrowed her eyes. "Impossible," she whispered. One of the directors noticed. "What is it?" "I thought I recognized someone." She continued walking. The moment passed. Near table 9, Christopher noticed one chair wobbling dangerously because of an uneven floor. Without attracting attention, he folded a cocktail napkin, slipped it beneath one leg, and tested the balance. Stable. A banquet employee watched from several feet away. "Thanks," Christopher smiled. "No worries." The employee assumed he worked in hospitality. He almost handed Christopher a radio before realizing the mistake. Christopher simply laughed. "It's all right." The employee apologized repeatedly. Christopher seemed genuinely amused. Meanwhile, Abigail watched everything from across the ballroom. Every misunderstanding felt like another embarrassment. Someone thought Christopher was event staff. Someone else assumed he was maintenance. Another guest asked where the restrooms were. Christopher politely pointed toward the hallway instead of correcting them. That somehow bothered Abigail even more. Why didn't he defend himself? Why didn't he tell people who he really was? The answer was simple, because Christopher had never believed dignity required an audience. Ethan returned with another drink. He leaned closer to Abigail. "You weren't kidding." She looked at him. About what? Your husband really blends into the background. Abigail forced another laugh. I know, Ethan smiled. If I didn't know better. He looked toward Christopher, who was helping another guest retrieve a dropped program booklet. I'd think the hotel hired him. Several executives laughed. Not loudly, just enough. Christopher looked up after handing the booklet back. He hadn't heard the comment, but he recognized something else. Abigail was laughing too, only briefly, only because everyone else was. Still, she laughed. The sound stayed with Christopher much longer than the joke itself. The laughter faded almost as quickly as it had begun. Only Christopher seemed unchanged. He thanked the banquet server who refilled his sparkling water and stepped away from the conversation, giving everyone else more room around the cocktail table. Behind him, Ethan Brooks watched with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. There he goes, Ethan said quietly. Still impossible to read. One of the finance executives chuckled. Maybe consultants are trained that way. No, Ethan replied. They're trained to make simple things sound expensive. Several people laughed again. Christopher didn't hear them. He had wandered toward one of the tall ballroom windows overlooking Monroe Street. Chicago glittered beneath the October night. Traffic moved steadily below. For a few peaceful seconds, the noise inside the ballroom disappeared. Christopher slipped his old leather notebook from his inside pocket. Not to work, simply out of habit. He checked tomorrow's handwritten schedule. 8:30. Video conference with a manufacturing client in Ohio. 11. Site visit outside Milwaukee. 2:30. Meeting with a hospital operations team. Nothing extraordinary. Just another workday. He tucked the notebook away. Behind him, Abigail spotted the familiar movement. Not the notebook again. She had teased him about carrying it for years. Why don't you use an iPad like everyone else? Christopher always answered the same way. Paper never runs out of battery. Tonight, that answer suddenly felt embarrassing instead of charming. Ethan noticed her expression. You all right? She forced a smile. I'm fine. You don't look fine. She hesitated. It's just... What? I wish Christopher would mingle a little more. He seems happy. I know. But... She lowered her voice. I don't want people thinking he's uncomfortable. Ethan smiled knowingly. They're probably just wondering what he does. Abigail looked toward Christopher again. He was helping another hotel employee move a decorative planter that blocked a service door, without being asked, without expecting thanks. The employee shook his hand gratefully. Christopher simply nodded. Ethan watched the exchange. He certainly likes helping. Abigail laughed softly. He's always been like that. You trained him well. She laughed again, this time a little louder. Christopher turned at the sound. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the ballroom. Christopher smiled. Abigail smiled back. Then, almost immediately, turned back toward Ethan. Christopher looked away first. The narrator noticed something almost invisible. Christopher had stopped expecting Abigail to come stand beside him. He simply accepted where she had chosen to stand. Across the ballroom, the master of ceremonies announced that dinner would begin in 15 minutes. Guests slowly moved toward assigned tables. Large round tables filled the ballroom. Each held 10 guests. Crystal glasses, white roses, small gold candles. Christopher found his seat beside Abigail. Across from them sat Ethan Brooks. To Ethan's right sat Monica Reynolds Redwood's vice president of human resources. Beside Christopher sat an elderly investor named Leonard Chambers. Leonard studied Christopher carefully. I don't believe we've met. Christopher Hernandez. Leonard smiled. Leonard Chambers. They shook hands. Christopher's grip was relaxed. Not competitive. Leonard appreciated that immediately. What line of work are you in? Operations consulting. Leonard nodded. Tough business. It can be. What industries? A little of everything. Leonard smiled. That's another way of saying confidential. Christopher returned the smile. Usually. Leonard seemed genuinely interested. Before he could ask another question, Ethan leaned forward. So, Christopher? The entire table looked toward him. You've kept us guessing all evening? Christopher looked up calmly. I'm sorry. What exactly does an operations consultant do? Christopher answered simply. It depends on what the client needs. Monica laughed politely. That's still pretty broad. Christopher nodded. It usually starts with listening. And then, finding problems. And then, fixing them. Ethan smiled. So basically efficiency. In many cases. What size companies? Christopher reached for his water. Different sizes. Ethan leaned farther across the table. Come on. We're all business people here. You can tell us. Christopher looked directly at him. I really can't. NDA. Christopher nodded once. Ethan laughed loudly enough for neighboring tables to hear. I've always found that funny. Several people looked over. The more secretive someone sounds, he shrugged theatrically. The smaller the clients usually are. A few executives laughed. Not everyone. Christopher remained silent. Leonard Chambers watched him closely. Most men would have defended themselves. Christopher simply buttered a dinner roll. Ethan continued. So what's the biggest company you've ever worked with? Christopher took a bite before answering. I can't say. Even the industry. I'd rather not. Monica attempted to lighten the mood. I suppose that's professional. Ethan smirked. Or convenient. Abigail shifted uneasily. She could have ended the conversation. She could have simply said, Christopher respects confidentiality. Instead, she laughed. Oh, don't encourage him. The table looked at her. He answers everything like it's classified. More laughter. Christopher quietly placed his fork on the plate. He looked toward Abigail. She didn't notice. She continued speaking. Honestly, most of his projects are much smaller than what everyone here deals with. Christopher's eyes remained on her. Not angry, simply listening. Ethan smiled wider. So you're saying we shouldn't expect billion-dollar clients? Abigail shook her head. I think the biggest thing he manages is making sure warehouses don't lose inventory. The table laughed again. Christopher could have corrected her. She didn't actually know the size of his clients. He never discussed them. Instead, he lifted his water glass, took one slow sip, said nothing. Leonard Chambers noticed. Monica noticed too. Neither laughed this time. Ethan wasn't finished. So tell me this. Christopher looked at him. What's your annual revenue? Abigail immediately answered before Christopher opened his mouth. Oh, Ethan, she waved dismissively. We've never cared much about that. Christopher looked toward her again. She smiled awkwardly. Christopher's happy living simply. Someone from another table overheard. That's refreshing. Ethan chuckled. Or financially necessary. Several executives laughed harder this time. Christopher's breathing remained slow. His shoulders never tensed. Only one small movement betrayed his feelings. His right thumb pressed lightly against the cold glass in his hand. Nothing more. The narrator knew exactly what Christopher was doing. He had learned years earlier that emotional reactions usually belonged to the person seeking attention. Silence belonged to the person in control. Across the ballroom, Margaret Sullivan had just finished speaking with 2 board members. As she turned towards the dining area, her eyes landed once again on Christopher. This time she stopped walking completely. Recognition flashed across her face. It can't be, she whispered. A board member beside her frowned. "What?" Margaret looked toward Christopher without answering. At that exact moment, Ethan leaned back in his chair with another grin. "You know what I like about Christopher?" Nobody answered. "He doesn't seem ambitious." Abigail laughed softly. "That's true." Ethan raised his champagne glass. "No offense. But every company needs ordinary people, too." Christopher met Ethan's eyes. "No offense taken." The calm answer somehow disappointed Ethan. He had expected irritation. Instead, he received courtesy. He decided to push harder. "So, Christopher, if Redwood ever needed someone to supervise maintenance operations," he smiled, "I'd recommend you." Several people burst into laughter. Even guests from neighboring tables turned to see what had happened. Abigail covered her mouth, then laughed too. Not because the joke was especially clever, because everyone else had. Christopher heard her clearly this time, every note, every second. He looked at the woman he had married. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking around the table, making sure everyone else saw that she could laugh at her own husband. Something settled quietly inside Christopher. Not anger, something colder. Acceptance. Leonard Chambers slowly placed his fork down. "That's enough." The words were quiet, but firm. Ethan looked surprised. "I was only joking," Leonard answered evenly. "The best jokes don't require humiliating someone." For the first time all evening, the table became completely silent. Ethan shrugged. No harm intended. Christopher spoke before Leonard could respond. "It's all right." His voice remained calm. "No one's harmed." The words sounded ordinary, yet Leonard noticed something hidden beneath them. Christopher wasn't saying he felt fine. He was saying the damage had happened long before tonight. Before anyone could speak again, the ballroom lights dimmed. The jazz band stopped playing. Every conversation across the room faded into silence. A spotlight illuminated the main entrance. The master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice echoed through the enormous ballroom, "please join me in welcoming the new Chief Executive Officer of Redwood Nexus Technologies." Every executive rose from their chair. Every face turned toward the grand entrance. The double doors slowly opened. The ballroom stood as one. Hundreds of executives faced the entrance. The orchestra stopped completely. Even the waitstaff paused where they stood. Nathaniel Grant entered without ceremony. He was 56 years old, tall, broad-shouldered with silver hair, and the calm confidence of someone who no longer needed to prove he belonged in any room. His tuxedo was immaculate, but unlike many executives, nothing about him appeared calculated. He greeted people naturally. A handshake here, a nod there, a brief smile for an elderly board member. No dramatic entrance, no rehearsed performance. The applause grew louder as he walked toward the stage. Christopher joined everyone else in clapping. His expression remained unchanged. He had known Nathaniel Grant for nearly 9 years. Not socially, professionally. Only 3 people in the room knew that. Nathaniel didn't immediately climb the stage. Instead, he slowly greeted directors lining the front tables. Harold Whitmore, Margaret Sullivan, Leonard Chambers. Each exchanged quiet words with him. Then Nathaniel's eyes drifted across the ballroom. They moved without urgency, scanning faces, department heads, regional managers, vice presidents. His gaze suddenly stopped, nearly 40 feet away, standing beside table 9, Christopher Hernandez. Nathaniel's steps slowed, just slightly. Margaret Sullivan noticed immediately. She followed his line of sight, then smiled to herself. "So, it really is him." Nathaniel said nothing. He simply changed direction. The movement was subtle. Only people watching him carefully noticed. Instead of continuing toward the stage, He began walking diagonally across the ballroom. Toward table 9. Ethan Brooks whispered to Abigail, "I think he's greeting every table." "Looks like it." Someone else added, "Smart move for a new CEO." Nathaniel continued walking, closer, 20 feet, 15, 10. Christopher looked up. Recognition appeared instantly. Not surprise, recognition. He offered the same quiet smile he gave almost everyone. Nathaniel returned it, without hesitation, without looking at anyone else first. The CEO extended his hand. "Christopher?" Christopher accepted it. "Nathaniel." The handshake lasted only a moment, yet everything around them seemed to stop. The people nearest table 9 stared openly. Most had expected Mr. Hernandez, or "Nice to meet you." Instead, they had heard first names, as though two old colleagues had unexpectedly crossed paths. Nathaniel smiled. "I wasn't sure you'd come." Christopher answered calmly. "My wife invited me." Nathaniel glanced politely toward Abigail. "It is a pleasure finally meeting you." Abigail blinked. "You... know Christopher?" Nathaniel looked almost puzzled by the question. "Know him?" A small smile crossed his face. "I've been hoping I'd see him tonight." Ethan looked from one man to the other. His confident smile faded slightly. Nathaniel turned back toward Christopher. "I still owe you dinner." Christopher laughed softly. "I don't think that's true." "It absolutely is. You've already thanked me enough." Nathaniel shook his head. "I disagree." Around the table, no one spoke. Every executive listened, trying to understand, trying to connect pieces that didn't fit. Nathaniel looked toward the stage. "They're probably wondering where I disappeared." Christopher nodded. "They usually do?" Nathaniel smiled again. "I'll catch up with you after the presentation." Christopher answered with the same calm tone. "I'll be here." Nathaniel gave a final nod, then continued toward the stage. The ballroom remained unusually quiet until he stepped onto the platform. Only then did the applause begin again. Not because he had asked for it, because people suddenly realized they had been watching something they couldn't explain. At table 9, Ethan stared at Christopher. "What was that?" Christopher looked at him. "A greeting." "No. I mean," Ethan searched for better words. "You know the CEO." Christopher poured himself more water. "We've worked together." "When?" "A while ago." Ethan laughed nervously. "Worked together? How?" Christopher answered exactly as before. "I consulted." The answer irritated Ethan. "You consulted for him?" Christopher nodded once. "For his previous company." Abigail interrupted. "You never told me that." Christopher looked at her. "You never asked about client names." The sentence wasn't cruel. It was simply true. Abigail opened her mouth, then closed it again, because she couldn't remember ever asking. Not once. She had asked about income, travel, schedules. She had never asked whom he helped. Monica Reynolds leaned forward. "Which company?" Christopher smiled politely. "I can't discuss that." Ethan rolled his eyes. "Still with the confidentiality?" Christopher simply nodded. "Yes." The Master of Ceremonies introduced Nathaniel Grant. Applause echoed once more. Nathaniel thanked everyone for attending. His opening remarks were brief, professional, confident. He spoke about Redwood's future, innovation, operational excellence, customer trust. Christopher listened carefully. He noticed Nathaniel had changed one phrase. Years earlier, Nathaniel always said growth creates opportunity. Tonight he said integrity creates growth. Christopher smiled almost imperceptibly. That wasn't an accidental change. Nathaniel continued. The companies that survive difficult markets aren't always the biggest. He paused. They're the ones willing to confront uncomfortable truths. Christopher lowered his eyes slightly. That sentence sounded familiar. Very familiar. 9 years earlier, he had written almost those exact words on a whiteboard during a crisis meeting. Nathaniel had never forgotten them. The speech continued: department goals, future investments, employee recognition. Everything appeared normal. Yet every few minutes, Nathaniel's eyes drifted back toward table 9. Toward Christopher. Abigail noticed. So did Ethan. Neither understood why. During the applause after the speech, Ethan leaned toward Abigail again. Did you know about this? She shook her head slowly. No. You've never mentioned your husband knowing Nathaniel Grant. I didn't know. You didn't know. No. Ethan stared at Christopher. The old pickup, the ordinary suit, the quiet consultant. None of it fit. Dinner resumed, conversations restarted, but the atmosphere had changed. People from neighboring tables began glancing toward Christopher more frequently. Some recognized that Nathaniel had greeted him unusually warmly. Others assumed they had once attended the same university. Speculation spread quietly across the ballroom. Christopher remained completely unaffected. He complimented the salmon, asked Leonard Chambers about his grandchildren after noticing a family photo on the older man's phone, thanked every server who cleared plates. Nothing about his behavior changed. That consistency impressed Leonard more than any title ever could. Most people changed when attention arrived. Christopher didn't. Half an hour later, dessert was served. Small conversations filled the ballroom. Nathaniel had left the stage and begun circulating again, this time accompanied by board members. Harold Whitmore, Margaret Sullivan, 2 major investors. As the group moved through the ballroom, Harold leaned toward Nathaniel. You're really going to do it tonight? Nathaniel smiled. I've waited long enough. Margaret nodded. He deserves it. Harold looked toward Christopher. I don't think he wants attention. No, Nathaniel agreed. He never has. But sometimes the truth belongs to more than one person. Meanwhile, Abigail had become increasingly uneasy. She leaned toward Christopher. Why didn't you tell me? Christopher looked at her. What? That you knew Nathaniel. I've mentioned him before? She frowned. When you asked once how a manufacturing turnaround in Indiana went. I said the client appreciated the work. Abigail searched her memory. A vague recollection surfaced. Late one evening, Christopher had come home exhausted. She had barely looked up from her laptop. Good meeting, he had answered. The client signed the recovery plan. She had replied, That's nice, then returned to her emails. That had been the entire conversation. She had never asked the client's name. Christopher hadn't volunteered it, not because he was hiding anything, because confidentiality mattered, and because he assumed if she wanted to know more, she would ask. Abigail looked away. For the first time that evening, she realized how little she actually knew about the work her husband had spent years doing. Not because he had been secretive, because she had stopped being curious. Across the ballroom, Nathaniel quietly accepted a microphone from the master of ceremonies once again. The orchestra stopped. Guests looked toward the stage. Nathaniel smiled warmly. There is one final recognition I'd like to make tonight. Christopher slowly set down his coffee cup. Without knowing why, he suddenly had a feeling the evening was about to change forever. The ballroom became silent again. Nathaniel Grant stood alone beneath the crystal chandeliers, one hand resting lightly on the podium. He waited until every conversation disappeared before speaking. I've spent the last 3 weeks meeting the incredible people who make Redwood Nexus Technologies what it is. A warm round of applause followed. Nathaniel smiled politely. But before I accepted this position, I promised our board of directors something. He paused. I promised that this company would become a place where truth mattered more than appearance. Christopher quietly folded his napkin onto the table. He had heard Nathaniel open speeches this way before, never casually, always with purpose. Nathaniel continued. Many of you know my career began at Orion Industrial Systems. Several executives nodded. It was the hardest 5 years of my professional life. Another pause. When I became CEO there, the company was losing nearly $11 million every month. The room listened carefully. The banks expected bankruptcy. Shareholders expected liquidation. Employees expected layoffs. Nathaniel looked across the ballroom. I expected to fail. No one laughed. The honesty caught everyone's attention. I hired every major consulting firm I could find. They produced beautiful presentations, expensive reports, impressive terminology. They solved nothing. Christopher lowered his eyes. He already knew the story. Nathaniel looked toward table 9. Then someone gave me a phone number. No name, only a phone number. They told me. Nathaniel smiled faintly. If this man couldn't solve our problem, nobody could. Across the ballroom, Abigail felt a strange tension settle in her chest. Christopher remained perfectly still. Nathaniel continued. When I first met him, I almost canceled the meeting. Soft laughter moved through the audience. He arrived driving an old pickup truck. More laughter. He wore work boots, a plain blue jacket. He carried a leather notebook that looked older than my oldest daughter. The laughter became louder. Nathaniel waited. Then his expression became serious. I almost made the biggest mistake of my career. The laughter disappeared instantly. He walked through every factory. He spoke with janitors before executives. He ate lunch with warehouse employees. He asked questions nobody else thought to ask. And after 6 days, Nathaniel raised one finger. He found the problem every global consulting firm had completely missed. Christopher remembered those 6 days vividly, not because of success, because they had been exhausting. 3 factories, almost 50 miles of warehouse corridors, thousands of handwritten observations, little sleep, countless conversations with employees who believed nobody important had ever cared what they thought. Nathaniel continued. He never blamed anyone. He never raised his voice. He simply showed us evidence. Not opinions. Evidence. The room remained silent. Within 18 months, Nathaniel looked toward the board members. Our company became profitable again. Harold Whitmore smiled. He remembered reading those reports years ago. Nathaniel spoke more softly. Wall Street praised my leadership. Business magazines interviewed me. I accepted awards. I stood on stages like this. He paused again. And the man responsible? Nathaniel looked directly at Christopher. Went home without allowing anyone to mention his name. A wave of quiet whispers spread through the ballroom. Abigail slowly turned toward her husband. Christopher kept his eyes on the stage. Nothing about his posture changed. Nathaniel rested both hands on the podium. I asked him many times why. He always answered exactly the same way. Nathaniel smiled. Your employees deserve confidence in their own company. If they think an outsider rescued them, they'll never believe they can solve the next problem themselves. The silence grew even heavier. Monica Reynolds looked toward Christopher with completely different eyes. Leonard Chambers smiled to himself. Margaret Sullivan crossed her arms, satisfied. She had wondered how long Nathaniel would wait before saying it aloud. Nathaniel took one slow breath. I've never forgotten that lesson. Leadership isn't collecting credit. It's creating strength in other people. Then he looked directly toward table 9. Christopher. Every head in the ballroom turned. Would you please stand? Abigail froze. Ethan Brooks looked from Nathaniel to Christopher, then back again. Christopher remained seated for a second. Not because he was surprised, because he genuinely disliked public attention. Nathaniel smiled. "Please." Christopher quietly stood. Nothing dramatic. No theatrical gesture. Just a man rising beside his dinner chair. The applause began almost immediately. Christopher looked uncomfortable. Not embarrassed. Simply uncomfortable. Nathaniel laughed softly. "I knew you'd hate this part." Scattered laughter eased the tension. Christopher answered just loudly enough for the nearest tables to hear. "You know me too well." Nathaniel nodded. "I do." The applause continued. Nathaniel raised one hand gently until the room became quiet once more. "I haven't finished." Christopher almost sighed. That made Nathaniel smile even more. Christopher Hernandez has spent nearly 2 decades helping organizations recover from disasters. Healthcare systems, manufacturing, transportation, energy, technology. Many of the companies you've admired owe part of their success to work he is legally forbidden from discussing. A stunned silence swept through the the ballroom. Executives who had laughed less than an hour earlier suddenly replayed every conversation in their minds. The simple suit, the old truck, the quiet answers. "I can't discuss my clients." "I'd rather not say." Those hadn't been evasions. They had been professional obligations. Nathaniel continued. "Last month, I called Christopher after accepting Redwood's CEO position." Christopher looked up. Nathaniel smiled warmly. "I asked him to become our chief operating officer." Gasps echoed around several tables. Abigail stared at Christopher. Her face lost all color. Nathaniel continued before anyone could react. "He thanked me and politely declined." Another wave of whispers moved through the ballroom. Nathaniel laughed. "He said, 'Redwood doesn't need another executive. It needs leaders who trust each other.'" Christopher lowered his head slightly. He wished Nathaniel would stop. Nathaniel knew exactly what he was thinking. "Sorry, Christopher. I'm almost done." The ballroom laughed. Nathaniel turned serious once more. "I respected his decision, but I told him that if I ever had the opportunity, I intended to publicly thank him." He stepped away from the podium, walked down the small staircase, then crossed directly toward table 9. Every camera in the ballroom followed him. Every conversation stopped. Nathaniel reached Christopher. The 2 men stood face to face. Nathaniel extended his hand once again. This time he held it firmly. "Thank you." Christopher smiled quietly. "You already did." "No." Nathaniel shook his head. "I thanked you privately." "Tonight," he looked around the ballroom, "I'm thanking you in front of people who should learn from you." Then Nathaniel said the sentence that froze every person in the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, when I need advice, this is the man I call." He turned slightly toward Christopher. "And whether he likes hearing it or not," Nathaniel smiled, "he'll always be boss to me." For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The silence became almost physical. Abigail's champagne glass slowly slipped from her fingers. It struck the white tablecloth, rolled onto the carpet, and stopped without breaking. She never noticed. Her eyes remained fixed on Christopher, on the quiet man she had introduced as ordinary, on the husband she had laughed at only an hour earlier, on the man the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar corporation had just called boss. For nearly 10 seconds, no one applauded. No one whispered. No one reached for another drink. The silence was unlike anything the grand ballroom had experienced that evening. It wasn't awkward. It was disbelief. Nathaniel Grant slowly released Christopher's hand and stepped back. He knew exactly what the room was thinking. He had expected it. Christopher, however, wished the evening would end. He had spent most of his professional life avoiding moments exactly like this. Recognition complicated things. Recognition created expectations. Recognition often distracted people from the work itself. Nathaniel picked up the microphone once more. "I know some of you are surprised." A few uneasy laughs echoed across the ballroom. "You should be." He smiled, because Christopher has spent most of his career making sure people never knew he was involved. He looked toward Margaret Sullivan. "Margaret." The company's outside legal counsel stood. She had anticipated this request hours earlier. Walking calmly to the stage, she carried a slim black leather portfolio. Several executives exchanged confused glances. Margaret addressed the audience. "For legal reasons, Mr. Hernandez has never been permitted to discuss the majority of his consulting engagements." She opened the portfolio. "However, a number of those agreements expired earlier this year." She removed several neatly organized documents, with written authorization from the companies involved. Certain information may now be publicly acknowledged." The room became even quieter. Christopher rubbed his forehead. Nathaniel noticed. "I'm sorry." Christopher smiled faintly. "You warned me." "I did. But I also warned you that one day I'd ignore your objections." That drew genuine laughter from the audience. Christopher shook his head. "You always were stubborn." Nathaniel grinned. "I learned from the best." Margaret placed the first document beneath a projection camera connected to the ballroom's large LED screens. Within seconds, a corporate memorandum appeared overhead. Orion Industrial Systems Confidential Strategic Operations Review. Lead External Advisor, Christopher Hernandez. Completion date: September 18th. Board approval executed. Several executives leaned forward. Some instinctively reached for their phones before realizing photography was prohibited during board presentations. Margaret displayed another page, then another. Signed board resolutions, operational recovery schedules, implementation milestones, financial improvement reports. Every page carried Christopher's name, not as a celebrity, not as a keynote speaker, as the lead advisor. The evidence required no dramatic explanation. Nathaniel simply watched the audience. He knew documents always spoke louder than speeches. Christopher had taught him that years ago. Margaret replaced the Orion documents with another file. This one displayed a different corporate logo. Midwest Freight Logistics, a transportation company many executives immediately recognized. Another consulting engagement. Another board approval. Another confidential restructuring plan. Again, lead advisor Christopher Hernandez. Gasps spread quietly across several tables. Monica Reynolds looked toward Christopher with open disbelief. "So it really was him," she whispered. Leonard Chambers nodded slowly. "I suspected." "You suspected?" Monica asked. Leonard smiled. "Not who?" "But what?" He glanced toward Christopher. "People who know that much usually don't feel the need to announce it." Margaret continued. "This next document has particular relevance tonight." She opened another folder. The Redwood Nexus Technologies logo appeared on the massive screens. Instantly, every employee in the ballroom sat straighter. The heading read, "Confidential Operational Recovery Initiative, 3 years earlier. Board restricted distribution." Several board members exchanged knowing looks. Nathaniel folded his arms quietly. Margaret continued. 3 years ago, Redwood experienced significant operational losses following supply chain disruptions. Many department heads remembered those difficult months. Layoff rumors, missed delivery targets, major investors demanding answers. Margaret turned another page. The consultant's identity had originally been redacted. A second document followed. Authorization for limited disclosure. The black redaction box had been officially removed. One name appeared, Christopher Hernandez. The ballroom erupted into whispers. Abigail stared at the giant screen. She remembered that period vividly. She had complained for weeks about impossible deadlines. Marketing budgets had been frozen. Every executive blamed operations. Christopher had quietly worked late during those same months. She remembered asking him once why he seemed tired. He had simply answered, "Busy week." Nothing more. She had never asked another question. Margaret spoke again. Mr. Hernandez completed the operational assessment in 21 days. The board accepted every primary recommendation. She displayed another page. Implementation score: 96%. Projected annual savings: $243 million. Actual savings after implementation: $251 million. The numbers filled the enormous screen. No one questioned them, because every figure carried board certification, independent audit signatures, legal verification. Nathaniel stepped beside Margaret. Christopher refused any public recognition. As always. He requested only one condition. Nathaniel smiled. The employees implementing these changes should receive the credit. Christopher quietly looked towards the floor. He remembered saying those words. He still believed them. Harold Whitmore slowly stood from the board table. His voice carried easily across the ballroom. "I've served on Redwood's board for 17 years. Every conversation stopped immediately. There are only 2 outside advisors in my career whose recommendations were accepted almost entirely without revision." He looked directly at Christopher. Christopher Hernandez was one of them. Harold nodded respectfully. The other retired 15 years ago. The statement landed heavily. Compliments from Harold Whitmore were almost legendary for their rarity. Across the ballroom, Ethan Brooks felt the room changing around him. Not dramatically, quietly. Executives who had laughed with him earlier were no longer smiling. Several had begun remembering his jokes, his comments, his mockery. He loosened his bow tie slightly. For the first time that evening, he wished people would stop looking in his direction. Nathaniel wasn't finished. He addressed the room once again. "I want to make one thing perfectly clear. Christopher has never asked me for business. He has never asked me for favors. He has never requested publicity. In fact," Nathaniel laughed softly, "he specifically asked me not to do what I'm doing tonight." More laughter spread through the ballroom. Christopher couldn't help smiling. "You're proving my point." Nathaniel shrugged playfully. "I can live with that." The room relaxed. The tension eased. Then a voice interrupted from the back. It belonged to one of Redwood's largest outside investors. "So if everything we're seeing is true," he paused, "why isn't Christopher running one of the largest consulting firms in America?" The question hung in the air. Everyone wanted the answer. Nathaniel looked toward Christopher. "Would you mind?" Christopher sighed, almost imperceptibly. He accepted the microphone, not because he wanted to speak, because refusing now would only create more curiosity. He stood quietly. The room waited. Christopher looked across hundreds of unfamiliar faces, then said only, "I've discovered something." His voice was calm, clear. "When people hire a famous consultant, they often trust the consultant more than their own employees." He paused. "I think that's backwards." Silence. "My job has never been to become the smartest person in the room. My job is to leave behind a room full of people who no longer need me." He handed the microphone back. Nothing more. No dramatic speech, no personal history, no list of accomplishments. Just 28 simple words. The applause began slowly, then spread through the ballroom. Within seconds, every person stood. Not because Nathaniel had asked, because Christopher had just demonstrated exactly why he had earned the respect described in every document. He never spoke to impress, only to clarify. Nathaniel watched the standing ovation with quiet satisfaction. Then he noticed something else. A member of Redwood's board had left his seat. Another followed. then another. One by one, directors who had worked with Christopher years earlier began walking toward Table 9. Christopher immediately realized what they intended. He whispered under his breath, "Oh no." Nathaniel smiled. Too late. The first board member reached Christopher, then the second, then the third. Each waited patiently for a chance to shake his hand. Across the ballroom, Abigail remained frozen in her chair. She wasn't watching the board anymore. She was watching her husband. For the first time in years, she realized she had spent more energy wondering how other people saw Christopher, than understanding who Christopher truly was. The standing ovation lasted longer than Christopher wanted. Long enough for the applause to become uncomfortable. Long enough for people who had ignored him an hour earlier to begin forming a line simply to introduce themselves. Christopher accepted every handshake with the same quiet courtesy. Nothing more. No business cards, no speeches, no attempt to capitalize on the moment. When a senior vice president handed him a gold-embossed card and said, "We should talk," Christopher slipped it into his pocket with a polite smile. "I appreciate that." He made no promises. Another executive approached. "I've read about one of your recovery plans." Christopher shook his head gently. "You probably read about the company's recovery." The executive laughed. "I suppose you're right." Christopher simply nodded. He never corrected people to make himself appear modest. He genuinely believed the distinction mattered. Across the ballroom, Nathaniel watched the interactions with quiet satisfaction. Harold Whitmore stepped beside him. "You were right." Nathaniel smiled. "About what?" "He hasn't changed." Nathaniel looked toward Christopher. "He never does." Harold folded his hands behind his back. "I've watched executives become famous overnight. They usually become different by breakfast." Nathaniel chuckled. "Christopher will probably stop for gas on the way home. And still buy that terrible coffee." Harold laughed. "I've heard about the coffee." "You should. It's apparently the only thing in America he refuses to improve." Both men smiled. Meanwhile, Ethan Brooks remained seated. His untouched dessert rested in front of him. For the first time in years, he didn't know how to enter a conversation. Every executive who had laughed with him earlier had quietly drifted away. Not intentionally, instinctively. People were repositioning themselves around influence. Ethan hated that realization. Even more, he hated recognizing it inside himself. Across the table, Monica Reynolds broke the silence. "You know," she looked directly at Ethan, "those maintenance jokes weren't your best work." Ethan forced a smile. "They were harmless." "Were they? I was kidding." Leonard Chambers calmly folded his napkin. "No." Everyone looked toward him. "You were measuring a man before understanding him." Ethan looked defensive. "Everyone misjudged him." Leonard nodded. "True. Most of us did." He paused. "The difference is that some people simply didn't know." His eyes settled on Ethan. "You enjoyed it." The sentence carried no anger, only observation. Ethan couldn't answer, because Leonard was correct. A few feet away, Abigail remained standing beside her chair. She had barely moved since Christopher finished speaking. The applause had ended. The conversations had resumed. Yet she felt strangely disconnected from all of it. The ballroom suddenly seemed unfamiliar. She watched Christopher speaking with board members she had spent years trying to impress. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. That was exactly why they respected him. Memory arrived unexpectedly. 3 years earlier. Christopher had come home after midnight. His jacket smelled faintly of machine oil. She remembered asking without looking away from her laptop, "Long day?" He had smiled. "Very." She had answered, "I left pasta in the refrigerator." then returned to her presentation for Redwood's quarterly marketing review. That had been the entire conversation. She had never asked where he had been. She now knew. He had been helping save her own company. She simply hadn't cared enough to ask. The realization settled heavily in her chest, not because Christopher had hidden the truth, because she had slowly stopped making room for it. Christopher finally excused himself from another conversation and walked toward one of the ballroom windows. For the first time all evening, he was alone. Chicago shimmered beyond the glass. Traffic flowed beneath orange streetlights. The city looked peaceful. Christopher preferred moments like this. Noise behind him. Silence ahead. Nathaniel quietly joined him a minute later. "No escape?" Christopher smiled. "You found me. I always do." They stood side by side. Neither spoke for several moments. Finally, Christopher sighed. "You didn't have to do all that." Nathaniel looked out over the city. "Yes, I did. I would have been perfectly happy remaining invisible." Nathaniel nodded. "I know. That's exactly why I couldn't leave it alone." Christopher laughed quietly. "I suppose arguing now would be pointless." "Very," Nathaniel smiled. "I've waited almost a decade. You weren't leaving tonight without hearing me." Christopher shook his head. "You've become more stubborn. I had a good teacher." Christopher smiled despite himself. Then his expression softened. "You embarrassed my wife." Nathaniel turned toward him. "No." Christopher remained silent. Nathaniel continued. "The truth embarrassed her." Those words lingered between them. Christopher didn't answer. Because deep down, he knew Nathaniel was right. Across the ballroom, Abigail watched the two men talking. She couldn't hear a single word. Yet their body language revealed years of mutual respect. No performance, no hierarchy. Just trust. She suddenly realized something else. Nathaniel wasn't grateful because Christopher had saved a company. He was grateful because Christopher had changed the kind of leader he became. That kind of influence couldn't be measured on a balance sheet. Margaret Sullivan approached Abigail carefully. "May I sit?" Abigail nodded automatically. Margaret lowered herself into the empty chair. "You look overwhelmed." "I am." Margaret smiled sympathetically. "I imagine." Abigail hesitated. "Did everyone know?" "The board did. For years." "And nobody ever told me?" Margaret looked genuinely surprised. "I assumed Christopher had." Abigail slowly shook her head. "No." Margaret considered that for a moment, then asked gently, "Did you ever ask?" The question landed harder than any accusation. Abigail searched desperately for a memory. One conversation, one evening, one genuine question about Christopher's work. Nothing came. Margaret saw the answer in her face. He protects client confidentiality very seriously. "I know. But if you'd asked what his days were like, I'm certain he would have told you everything he legally could." Abigail lowered her eyes. Margaret stood. "For what it's worth," she glanced toward Christopher. "I've worked with dozens of brilliant consultants. None of them impressed me as much as your husband. Not because he's the smartest," she smiled, "because he's the least interested in proving it." Then Margaret walked away. Abigail remained alone. The orchestra quietly resumed playing. Servers began clearing dessert plates. Guests returned to networking. Everything looked normal again. Except nothing felt normal anymore. Christopher eventually returned to the table. He pulled out his chair, picked up his coffee, took one sip, still warm. He noticed Abigail watching him. "Everything all right?" The question nearly broke her. Not because of what he said, because after everything that had happened, he was still asking whether she was all right. She opened her mouth. No words came. Christopher waited patiently. Finally, she whispered, "I'm sorry." Christopher looked at her for a long moment. His expression remained kind, but there was something new behind his eyes. A quiet distance that hadn't existed years earlier. He answered softly, "I know you are." Those 5 words sounded forgiving. They weren't. They were simply honest. Christopher wasn't angry anymore. Anger had already passed. What remained was something much more difficult to repair: trust. Before Abigail could say another word, Christopher quietly stood. "I think I'm going to head home." She looked up immediately. "The gala isn't over." Christopher glanced around the ballroom one final time. "I know." He picked up his old leather notebook from the table, slipped it inside his jacket, buttoned the same charcoal suit everyone had overlooked just hours earlier. Then he looked toward the ballroom doors. For the first time that evening, going home sounded far more appealing than staying where everyone had finally learned his name. Christopher left the ballroom without attracting attention, or at least he tried to. The heavy doors closed quietly behind him, muting the orchestra and conversations, until only the soft hum of the hotel lobby remained. The marble floor reflected warm golden lights. A fountain murmured in the center of the atrium. The silence felt familiar, comfortable. He loosened his tie as he crossed toward the valet stand. The young attendant recognized him immediately. "Good evening, sir." Christopher smiled. "Evening? I'll bring your truck around." "Thank you." The attendant hurried outside. Christopher remained alone beneath the entrance canopy. A cool October wind swept through downtown Chicago. He inhaled deeply. For the first time that evening, his shoulders relaxed. Inside the ballroom, the opposite was happening. Abigail watched the closed doors. "He really left," she whispered. Nathaniel overheard her. "He usually does." She turned toward him. "I need to talk to him." Nathaniel studied her face carefully. "You probably do." She took one uncertain step, then stopped. "I don't even know where to begin." Nathaniel's expression softened. "Then don't begin with explanations." She frowned. "What do you mean?" He answered calmly. "People often explain because they're trying to protect themselves." He paused. "Start with listening." The advice sounded strangely familiar, because Christopher had spent years doing exactly that. Abigail hurried toward the lobby. Ethan called after her. "Abigail." She didn't stop. She didn't even look back. Nathaniel watched her disappear through the ballroom doors. Then he slowly turned toward Ethan. Their eyes met. Nathaniel walked directly to his table. Not hurriedly, not angrily, simply with purpose. Ethan stood automatically. "Mr. Grant." Nathaniel extended his hand. Ethan quickly accepted it. "I've heard good things about your regional numbers." "Thank you, sir." Nathaniel nodded. "They're impressive." Relief flickered across Ethan's face. Maybe everything was normal after all. Then Nathaniel continued. "Leadership numbers. They concern me." Ethan's smile faded. "I'm sorry." Nathaniel kept his voice low enough that only the people at the table could hear. "A person's character eventually becomes visible. No matter how carefully it's hidden." Ethan swallowed. "I was only joking earlier." Nathaniel nodded once. "I know." He held Ethan's gaze. "I wasn't." Without another word, Nathaniel walked away. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. Yet Ethan felt as though the floor beneath him had shifted. Monica Reynolds quietly reached for her phone. She opened the internal executive directory, scrolled to Ethan Brooks' division, closed it again. Not because she planned immediate action, because she suddenly wanted to know much more about the culture inside his department. Meanwhile, outside the hotel, Christopher's aging dark blue Ford F-150 rolled beneath the entrance canopy. The valet handed him the keys. "I filled your coffee mug." Christopher looked surprised. "You remembered?" The young attendant smiled. "You always tip, even when someone else parks your truck." Christopher laughed softly. "I appreciate it." "No problem, sir." Christopher climbed into the driver's seat. The dashboard looked exactly as it had that morning. Worn leather, an old baseball cap, a flashlight, his notebook. Nothing expensive, nothing designed to impress. Exactly the way he preferred it. He started the engine. The truck rumbled gently. Just as he shifted into reverse, someone knocked lightly on the driver's window. Christopher looked over. Abigail. Slightly out of breath. He lowered the window. "You left." "I did." "I wasn't finished talking." Christopher looked at her quietly. "We hadn't started." She looked down briefly. "Can we go somewhere?" Christopher considered the question, then nodded toward the passenger door. "It's cold." She climbed inside. Neither spoke as Christopher pulled away from the hotel. Downtown traffic flowed steadily. Glass skyscrapers reflected thousands of lights. For several minutes, only the sound of the engine filled the truck. Christopher didn't rush the silence. He never had. Abigail finally spoke. "I feel like I don't know you." Christopher kept his eyes on the road. "You know me." "No." She shook her head. "I knew routines." She looked toward him. "I knew schedules. I knew what time you usually got home." "But I don't think I knew—" She struggled to find the words. "Who you really are." Christopher remained silent. She continued. "When Nathaniel called you boss." I couldn't breathe. Christopher gave a faint smile. "He always exaggerates." "No." "He doesn't?" Christopher glanced at her briefly. "He's loyal. There's a difference." She looked at him carefully. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Christopher answered honestly. "I thought you weren't interested." The sentence contained no accusation, only memory. Abigail closed her eyes. "I wasn't." The admission hurt, because it was true. Christopher nodded slightly. "I know." "I should have asked." "You could have." "I should have listened." Christopher didn't respond. Traffic slowed near the Chicago River. Red brake lights stretched across the bridge. Abigail looked out the passenger window. I kept thinking success looked a certain way. Christopher waited. "Big titles? Luxury cars? Designer watches?" She laughed bitterly. "I measured everything by appearances." Christopher finally spoke. "Most people do. But you didn't. I learned not to." She looked toward him. "When—" Christopher smiled faintly. "When I was 28. He remembered the year clearly. His first consulting contract. An executive had dismissed him because his suit wasn't expensive enough. 6 months later, the same executive hired him after his company nearly collapsed. Christopher never forgot the lesson. Appearance creates first impressions. Results create lasting ones. Abigail stared at the windshield. "I laughed tonight." Christopher remained quiet. "I heard you." The words landed gently, which somehow made them hurt even more. "I don't know why I laughed," Christopher answered softly. "I do." She turned toward him. "You wanted the room to accept you." He paused. "So you joined the room." A tear rolled silently down her cheek. Christopher wasn't trying to wound her. He was simply describing what had happened. "And you?" she asked quietly. "Were you angry?" Christopher thought for several seconds. "No." "You weren't." "I was disappointed." He looked ahead. "Not because you laughed. Because you needed to." Silence returned. The truck continued west. After several more blocks, Christopher pulled into a quiet public park overlooking Lake Michigan. The parking lot was nearly empty. He switched off the engine. Neither moved. The lake reflected thousands of city lights. Small waves reached the shoreline with steady rhythm. Abigail finally whispered, "Have I been a bad wife?" Christopher didn't answer immediately. He knew careless honesty could become cruelty. He chose his words carefully. "I don't think you've been intentionally cruel." She listened. "I think—" He looked toward the dark water. "You slowly stopped seeing me." Those words broke something inside her. Not dramatically, quietly. She covered her face with both hands. For several minutes she cried without speaking. Christopher remained beside her. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer rehearsed comfort, didn't tell her everything would be all right. Some pain needed space before healing could begin. When Abigail finally looked up again, her eyes were red. "I don't know how to fix this." Christopher rested one hand on the steering wheel. "Neither do I." His honesty frightened her more than anything else that evening, because for the first time since they married, Christopher wasn't pretending the answer would be simple. He looked out across the dark lake. "There are problems you solve with intelligence." He paused. "And others that only change after trust is rebuilt." Abigail understood immediately. This wasn't a conversation that would end tonight. It had taken years to create the distance between them. Years would not disappear in a single apology. Far behind them, the lights of the hotel still illuminated the Chicago skyline. Inside that ballroom, everyone had finally learned Christopher Hernandez's professional value. Sitting beside him in the quiet darkness, Abigail was only beginning to understand his worth as a man. The drive home ended in silence. Not an uncomfortable silence, a thoughtful one. Christopher pulled into the driveway of their 2-story brick home in Naperville just after 11 o'clock. The porch light glowed softly against the autumn night. Nothing about the house suggested extraordinary success. No security gates, no luxury sports cars, no extravagant landscaping. Just a well-kept home on a quiet street where children rode bicycles every afternoon. Christopher switched off the engine. "We're home." Abigail looked through the windshield. For years she had called this place ordinary. Tonight it felt completely different. Christopher opened the front door with the same worn brass key he had carried for years. Inside, everything remained exactly where it belonged. A pair of hiking boots near the entrance, family photographs lining the hallway. A bookshelf filled with history, engineering, leadership, and biographies. No trophies. No framed magazine covers. No awards displayed on the walls. Abigail suddenly noticed something she had overlooked for years. The house reflected Christopher. Useful. Quiet. Without unnecessary decoration. Christopher hung his jacket in the closet. "I'm going to make some tea." She nodded silently. He disappeared into the kitchen. Within minutes, the familiar sound of boiling water filled the house. The routine calmed him. Simple actions always had. Abigail slowly wandered through the living room. Her eyes stopped at one photograph, Christopher and his late father rebuilding an old wooden fishing dock. She remembered the picture. She had walked past it thousands of times. She had never asked about it. Another photograph. Christopher standing beside a group of factory workers. Everyone wore hard hats. Everyone smiled. There was no company logo visible, only people. She had never asked where that picture had been taken either. The realization became impossible to ignore. She hadn't lacked opportunities to know her husband. She had ignored them. Christopher returned, carrying 2 steaming mugs. He placed one in front of her. Chamomile, her favorite. Despite everything, he still remembered. She wrapped both hands around the warm cup. "Thank you." He sat across from her. Neither rushed the conversation. After several minutes, Abigail finally spoke. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. How much money have you actually made consulting?" Christopher smiled faintly. "I wondered when that question would come." She looked embarrassed. "I don't mean it like that." "I know." He considered the question. "I've done well." "How well?" He stood. Walked into the small study adjoining the living room. Returned carrying a simple blue folder. He placed it on the coffee table. Inside were financial statements, investment summaries, retirement accounts, college savings funds, property records, everything neatly organized. Abigail stared at the numbers. She blinked once. Then again. The investment portfolio alone exceeded $12 million. Several municipal bonds, long-term index funds, commercial real estate partnerships, a charitable foundation account. No speculative investments, no flashy purchases, everything conservative, everything carefully planned. She looked up slowly. "We're—" Christopher finished the sentence gently. "Financially independent." Her voice barely worked. "Since when?" "About 6 years." She simply stared. 6 years. They had been financially secure for 6 years. Yet Christopher had continued accepting consulting projects, driving the same truck, wearing ordinary clothes, living in the same neighborhood. She whispered, "Why?" Christopher answered without hesitation. "Because money stopped being the point a long time ago." He took a sip of tea. "I enjoy solving problems." She looked back at the folder. "You never told me." Christopher remained quiet for several moments. Then he answered honestly. "I tried." Abigail frowned. "When?" He walked towards the bookshelf, removed a leather journal, opened it. Inside were handwritten notes, meeting summaries, goals, plans. Tucked between 2 pages was an envelope. Christopher handed it to her. "I found this last year." She opened it carefully. Inside was an anniversary card. Unfinished. Dated almost 7 years earlier. Her handwriting, she began reading. "Christopher, I'm sorry I've been so busy lately. I know you've wanted to talk about retirement planning." She stopped. Memory returned instantly. She had started writing the card after Christopher suggested meeting with a financial planner. Then an important marketing campaign had demanded her attention. She never finished the card, never gave it to him, never scheduled the conversation. Christopher quietly said, "I think I asked 3 more times." Abigail closed her eyes. "I remember. But I kept postponing it." He nodded. "Eventually I handled it myself." Not out of anger, out of necessity. He had built their financial future alone because waiting forever wasn't responsible. Abigail looked around the room. Every sacrifice suddenly became visible. The paid-off mortgage, the investment accounts, the emergency fund, the college scholarship fund Christopher had quietly established for his niece after his sister passed away. She had signed paperwork without reading most of it, trusting Christopher, yet never appreciating the work behind it. A knock interrupted the silence. Christopher glanced toward the clock. Nearly midnight. That's unusual. He opened the front door. Nathaniel Grant stood outside wearing an overcoat, holding a plain white bakery box. Christopher laughed. "You tracked me down." Nathaniel smiled. "I know where my favorite consultant lives." He lifted the box. "Apple pie." Christopher stepped aside. "You bribed me." "I came prepared." Nathaniel entered. Abigail stood automatically. Nathaniel greeted her warmly. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Christopher answered first. "You probably are." Nathaniel grinned. "I assumed so." They all sat together. Nathaniel opened the bakery box. 3 forks, no plates. Christopher laughed again. "You really planned this." "I've known you too long?" For a few minutes, they ate pie in comfortable silence. Then Nathaniel looked toward Abigail. I owe you an apology. She looked confused. For what? I embarrassed your family tonight. She shook her head immediately. No, Nathaniel answered gently. I still should have warned you. Christopher raised an eyebrow. You tried warning me. Nathaniel smiled. I knew you wouldn't tell her. Christopher didn't deny it. Nathaniel continued. I've always admired one thing about Christopher. He never advertises himself. But there's a downside. He looked toward Abigail. People sometimes mistake silence for absence. She nodded slowly. I did. Nathaniel leaned back. When Orion recovered, I asked Christopher why he kept refusing interviews. Christopher smiled. You've already told that story. Not all of it. Nathaniel looked toward Abigail again. He finally told me something I've never forgotten. Nathaniel repeated Christopher's words exactly. If someone only respects me after discovering my accomplishments. They never respected me. The room became quiet. Abigail felt tears gathering again. Christopher hadn't said those words with bitterness. He had simply accepted them as truth. Nathaniel continued softly. I've watched dozens of powerful people chase admiration. They're exhausted. He looked at Christopher. This man never chased it. And somehow, he earned more of it than anyone else I know. Christopher shook his head. You always exaggerate. Nathaniel laughed. I've had 9 years to collect evidence. The three of them shared a small smile. Then Nathaniel became serious. There is one more reason I came tonight. Christopher looked at him. What happened? Nathaniel folded his hands. The board met after you left. Christopher frowned slightly. Tonight? Yes. Nathaniel's expression grew thoughtful. They made a decision. Christopher immediately understood that something significant had happened. What decision? Nathaniel looked directly into Christopher's eyes. I told them you would probably refuse. Christopher sighed quietly. That usually means I'm about to. Nathaniel smiled. Probably. He reached inside his coat and placed a sealed envelope on the coffee table. The board asked me to deliver this personally. Christopher looked at the envelope, but made no move to open it. Nathaniel simply said, I think you should read it in the morning. Christopher studied his friend's face. Whatever was inside, it was important enough for the entire board of Redwood Nexus Technologies to vote on after midnight. Christopher did not open the envelope that night. He placed it neatly on the corner of his desk. Then he turned off the study lamp. If the board waited until midnight, he said quietly, it can wait until morning. Nathaniel smiled. That's exactly what I expected you to say. Abigail watched both men. Neither seemed anxious. Neither appeared excited, as though whatever was inside the envelope mattered less than the people sitting in the room. Nathaniel stood. I should let you both get some rest. Christopher walked him to the front door. Before leaving, Nathaniel paused. There is one thing I hope you'll consider. Christopher folded his arms. I'm listening. Don't reject the proposal immediately. Christopher smiled. I haven't even read it. I know. Nathaniel laughed softly. But I know you. After Nathaniel drove away, the house became quiet again. Christopher checked the locks, as he always did, turned off the downstairs lights, then headed upstairs. Halfway up the staircase, he noticed Abigail still standing in the living room. She was staring at the envelope. You should get some sleep. She looked at him. Christopher. He waited. I'm afraid. He nodded once. So am I. She frowned. You are. I don't know what tomorrow looks like. His honesty surprised her again. Christopher never pretended certainty when he didn't have it. That was another thing she had failed to appreciate. The next morning arrived cool and bright. Sunlight spilled across the kitchen table. Christopher had already returned from his usual 6-mile walk before Abigail came downstairs. Coffee was ready. Breakfast was prepared. Egg whites, whole grain toast, fresh fruit. Exactly the same routine he had followed for years. Only now she noticed the discipline behind it. "You've been up long?" "About 2 hours." She glanced at the clock. 7:30. "You always wake up that early?" Christopher smiled. "Almost every day." "I never knew." "You were usually still asleep. Again. Not hidden. Simply unnoticed." After breakfast, Christopher finally carried the sealed envelope into the study. Abigail hesitated outside the door. "May I come in?" "Of course." Christopher carefully opened the envelope with a letter opener. Inside were 3 documents: a formal letter, a board resolution, and another sealed folder marked confidential. He began reading. His expression barely changed. Abigail couldn't read him. Finally, he handed her the first page. She read slowly. "Dear Mr. Christopher Hernandez, following unanimous approval by the Board of Directors, Redwood Nexus Technologies respectfully requests that you accept appointment as independent senior strategic advisor to the board. The position required no relocation, no executive authority, no operational reporting. Christopher would advise only during critical corporate decisions. The annual compensation nearly made Abigail stop breathing. $1.8 million. For approximately 60 consulting days each year." She looked up. "This is—" Christopher nodded. "Generous." She continued reading. "Complete independence. No office requirement. Freedom to decline assignments. No obligation to appear publicly." The agreement had obviously been designed specifically for him. Nathaniel understood him perfectly. Christopher opened the second document, the board resolution. Every director had signed it, including Harold Whitmore. Margaret Sullivan, 3 independent shareholders. The vote had been unanimous. Abigail whispered, "They really want you." Christopher remained thoughtful. "They trust me." "There isn't a difference." "There is." He looked at her. "Wanting someone and trusting someone aren't always the same." He opened the confidential folder last. Inside was a handwritten note. Not typed, handwritten, Nathaniel's writing. "Christopher, you once told me leadership means leaving people stronger than you found them. Redwood needs that more than another executive. Please think about it. No pressure, only respect." Nathaniel Christopher smiled quietly. "He knows exactly how to persuade me." Abigail watched him carefully. "Are you going to accept—" "I don't know." "You've already decided, haven't you?" Christopher laughed. "You know me better than that." She smiled sadly. "I'm trying to." At that moment, Christopher's phone vibrated. The caller ID displayed Monica Reynolds. He answered. "Good morning." Her voice sounded unusually cautious. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all." "I wanted to apologize." Christopher remained silent. Monica continued. "I didn't laugh yesterday." "No. But I also didn't stop it." Christopher appreciated the honesty. "Thank you." She hesitated. "There is something else." "I'm listening." "Our Human Resources Department received 3 anonymous complaints this morning." Christopher frowned slightly. "About what?" "Toxic leadership inside Ethan Brooks's division." Christopher didn't respond. Monica continued. "Apparently, several employees have documented months of public humiliation. Mocking. Favoritism. Retaliation against junior staff." She sighed. "The gala gave people courage." Christopher looked toward the window. "So they're finally speaking." "Yes. We've already opened a formal investigation." Christopher answered calmly. "Good." Monica hesitated again. I also wanted your advice." He smiled faintly. "You don't need my permission. I know. But, she paused. How would you approach something like this? Christopher answered without thinking. Collect evidence before conclusions. No exceptions. Even if you think you already know the answer. Monica smiled. I thought you'd say that? The system matters. It always does. After ending the call, Christopher returned the phone to his pocket. Abigail looked thoughtful. You could have told her Ethan deserved it. Christopher shook his head. I don't know that. She looked surprised. He humiliated you. He behaved badly. Christopher corrected gently. That's different. She considered the distinction. If evidence proves he abused employees, then consequences should follow. He looked directly at her. But consequences should come because of evidence, not because he embarrassed me. Those words stayed with Abigail. That was the difference. Christopher never confused personal feelings with justice. Later that afternoon, Christopher drove to a neighborhood hardware store. Not because he needed anything urgent. A kitchen cabinet hinge had become loose. He wanted to replace it. Abigail insisted on coming with him. Inside the store, several customers recognized Christopher from the previous evening. News had spread surprisingly fast. One older employee approached. Mr. Hernandez. Christopher smiled. Please. Christopher. The man nodded. I watched the gala online. My daughter works for Redwood. Christopher looked embarrassed. I'm glad. The employee extended his hand. I just wanted to thank you. Christopher frowned. For what? My daughter called this morning. He smiled proudly. She said people at work are talking about treating each other differently. They're asking better questions. They're listening. He shrugged. I don't know if you caused that. But she says you did. Christopher looked genuinely moved. Tell your daughter, he paused, to take care of the people around her. That matters more than remembering my name. The employee smiled. I will. As they walked toward the parking lot, Abigail quietly slipped her hand into Christopher's. He looked down. She hadn't done that in months, maybe longer. Neither mentioned it. Neither needed to. Small things mattered, especially after trust had been damaged. That evening, another phone call arrived, this time from Harold Whitmore. His voice carried the calm confidence of someone who had already made an important decision. Christopher. Good evening, Harold. I'll be brief. Christopher smiled. You usually are? Harold chuckled. I wanted you to hear this from me before tomorrow's press release. Christopher listened carefully. The board voted unanimously this afternoon. We've retained an independent outside firm. Human resources investigations regarding Ethan Brooks and several senior managers begin Monday morning. Christopher remained silent. Harold continued. No favoritism. No interference. Evidence only. Christopher finally answered. That's the right decision. I learned that from you. Harold paused. And Christopher? Yes. I hope you'll accept our offer. Christopher looked toward the unopened agreement resting on his desk. I haven't decided. I know. Harold's voice softened. But for the first time in years, our company has a chance to become the kind of place you always believed it could be. After the call ended, Christopher stood quietly by the study window. Outside, children laughed as they rode bicycles along the sidewalk. Ordinary life continued. Behind him on the desk lay an offer that could shape Redwood's future. And somewhere across the city, a formal investigation had already begun. Not because one man wanted revenge, but because the truth had finally been given room to speak. Monday morning arrived with the kind of clear October sky that made downtown Chicago appear almost unreal. Christopher was already in his study before sunrise. A yellow legal pad lay open beside his coffee. The employment agreement from Redwood rested nearby. still unsigned. He had highlighted only 3 paragraphs. Not the compensation, not the benefits, only the sections describing responsibilities. That was where his attention always went. Abigail stood quietly in the doorway. "You've been reading that for an hour." Christopher looked up with a faint smile. 43 minutes. She laughed softly. "I should have known you'd know the exact number." He folded the papers neatly. "I don't make decisions quickly. I've noticed." She stepped into the room. "What are you really thinking about?" Christopher looked out the window. "I'm wondering whether I can genuinely help." "You already have." "That's different." He paused. "Consultants solve problems. Leaders stay after the applause ends." The distinction mattered to him. Abigail nodded. "I think you're afraid of becoming part of the system." Christopher smiled. "I married a smart woman." The words warmed her. Not because they were romantic, because they sounded natural. Like the distance between them was beginning to narrow. At Redwood headquarters, however, the atmosphere was anything but calm. Employees spoke in unusually quiet voices. Conversation stopped whenever human resources representatives walked through the hallways. Conference rooms had been reserved all week. Independent investigators had arrived before 8 o'clock. No one knew exactly what would happen, only that something had changed. Monica Reynolds stood outside the executive conference room reviewing a thick binder. Complaint summaries, email records, performance evaluations, anonymous witness statements, everything was organized chronologically, everything documented. Harold Whitmore entered moments later. "You've prepared thoroughly?" Monica nodded. "I learned from Christopher." Harold smiled. "Good. Then today's meeting should focus on facts." Precisely at 9 o'clock, the investigation began. Ethan Brooks entered confidently. He still believed the complaints were exaggerated. He assumed the board simply wanted appearances. He did not realize how much documentation already existed. The lead investigator introduced herself. "My name is Laura Bennett." She represented one of the country's most respected workplace compliance firms. Her opening statement lasted less than 2 minutes. "This is not a disciplinary meeting. It is a fact-finding interview. We ask that every answer remain truthful." She placed a digital recorder on the table, then opened the first folder. "Ethan." He nodded. "Yes." "How would you describe your leadership style?" He smiled confidently. "Demanding." "But fair?" Laura made a note, then displayed several employee surveys. 24 responses. Anonymous. Independently verified. Only 2 described the department as respectful. The remaining 22 used remarkably similar language. Humiliating. Dismissive. Fear-based. Public embarrassment. Retaliation. Ethan's confidence began to weaken. Meanwhile, Christopher was repairing the loose kitchen cabinet hinge. He carefully tightened each screw, tested the door twice. Satisfied, he cleaned his tools before putting them away. Abigail watched from the kitchen island. "Most people would have replaced the whole cabinet," Christopher shrugged. "It wasn't broken. Just neglected." The sentence lingered. She wondered if he realized he had also described their marriage. Her phone buzzed. A message from Monica. "Can you ask Christopher if he'll take my call later?" "Nothing urgent." Abigail looked toward her husband. "Monica wants to speak with you." Christopher nodded. "After lunch." "You aren't curious?" "I assume she'll tell me when we talk." Again, no rushing, no unnecessary speculation. By early afternoon, the investigation had expanded. Several junior employees voluntarily submitted personal journals documenting months of interactions, calendar entries, meeting notes, screenshots, performance reviews. Patterns emerged, not isolated incidents, repeated behavior. Laura Bennett looked across the conference table at Harold. The consistency is notable. Harold simply answered, "Continue." Evidence remained the priority. No conclusions until every interview ended. Across town, Christopher arrived at a neighborhood community center. Every second Monday, he volunteered there. Very few people knew. He mentored young adults preparing for technical careers. No cameras, no publicity, only practical advice. Today's group included 12 students, electricians, mechanics, computer technicians. One young man looked discouraged. "My interview didn't go well." Christopher nodded. "What happened?" "They said I wasn't polished enough." Christopher smiled. "What do you know how to build?" The young man looked surprised. "Industrial control systems." "How many?" "Probably 40. Christopher leaned forward. "Then learn to communicate that." He paused. "But never mistake polish for substance. The world eventually notices substance." The students wrote down every word. Christopher wasn't delivering motivational speeches. He answered questions, shared mistakes, encouraged preparation. Exactly as he always had. After the session, an older volunteer approached him. "I watched the gala." Christopher laughed quietly. "I was hoping nobody here had." The volunteer smiled. "They're proud of you." Christopher looked toward the students leaving the building. "I'd rather they're proud of themselves." Back at Redwood, Laura Bennett concluded the final interview of the day. She closed the last folder, then addressed Harold and the board committee. "We have not reached formal conclusions." She chose every word carefully. "However, the volume of corroborating evidence is significant." Harold asked only one question. "Can the process remain impartial?" Laura nodded. "Absolutely. No recommendation will be made until every document has been reviewed." Harold looked satisfied. That's exactly how it should be. Late that afternoon, Monica called Christopher. "Am I interrupting?" "No." "I just finished mentoring." She smiled on the other end of the line. "I wanted you to know something." "I'm listening." "The investigation is real." Christopher remained quiet. "No shortcuts. No assumptions. No special treatment," he answered softly. "I'm glad." Monica hesitated. "I also wanted to thank you." "For what?" "You reminded me that justice isn't revenge." She laughed gently. "I almost forgot that this morning." Christopher smiled. "It happens. I wanted immediate answers. And now I want accurate ones." Christopher nodded. "Accuracy lasts longer." After ending the call, he walked outside. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the community center parking lot. Abigail had driven over to meet him. She leaned against the truck, waiting. "You look peaceful." "I am." She smiled. "Monica told you." He nodded. "They're doing it correctly." She opened the passenger door. "Can I ask something?" "Always." "If Ethan loses everything." She looked uncertain. "Will that make you feel better?" Christopher thought carefully before answering. "No." "It won't." "Then what would—" He looked toward the children playing basketball nearby. "I'd rather nobody had been treated that way in the first place." She stared at him. "So this was never about winning." Christopher shook his head. "I never wanted someone else to lose. I only wanted the truth to stop losing." The answer stayed with Abigail all the way home. That evening, they sat on the back porch watching the sun disappear behind the maple trees. No television, no phones, only quiet conversation. Christopher finally spoke. "I've made my decision." Abigail turned toward him. "About Redwood." He nodded once. "Tomorrow morning." "I'm meeting the board." She searched his face. You've accepted. Christopher smiled faintly. I've accepted. But not on their terms. Abigail laughed. I suspected there would be a condition. There are 3. What are they? Christopher looked toward the darkening sky. Every executive will complete leadership training. Anonymous employee feedback becomes mandatory. And, he smiled, no executive dining room. She blinked. No executive dining room. If leaders stop eating with employees, they eventually stop understanding them. Abigail laughed harder than she had in weeks. Only Christopher would negotiate million-dollar contracts over cafeteria seating. Neither of them realized that while they sat peacefully beneath the evening sky, the independent investigators had just uncovered one final piece of evidence, an internal email sent months before the gala. It would change not only Ethan Brooks's future, but explain why Christopher had been invited to that office party in the first place. Christopher arrived at Redwood Nexus Technologies at exactly 8:45 Tuesday morning. He parked his aging Ford F-150 in the visitor section. The nearest executive parking spaces remained empty. He could have used one. Nathaniel had already arranged temporary access. Instead, Christopher chose the longer walk across the parking lot. Old habits deserved respect. Employees entering the building noticed him almost immediately. Some smiled. Some nodded politely. Others simply watched. News of the gala had spread throughout every department. Christopher acknowledged every greeting with the same calm expression. No dramatic entrance, no security escort, no entourage. Just a man carrying a weathered leather notebook beneath one arm. Inside the executive boardroom, the atmosphere felt unusually relaxed. Harold Whitmore stood first. So you came? Christopher smiled. I said I'd think about it. Nathaniel laughed. You've already made us wait 48 hours. I know. You deserved at least that. The directors laughed quietly, not because the joke was particularly clever, because Christopher's calmness had become strangely reassuring. He took his seat. The unsigned agreement rested in front of him. Harold folded his hands. Before we begin, I want to thank you. Christopher shook his head. Let's wait until the paperwork is finished. Harold smiled. That's another reason we're grateful. Nathaniel leaned back. Go ahead. Christopher opened his notebook. 3 handwritten pages. Nothing typed. No presentation slides. No legal team. Just careful notes. I have 3 conditions. The room became completely silent. Christopher continued. Condition 1. No executive, including me, will be exempt from annual leadership evaluations. Several directors exchanged quick glances. Christopher explained. Financial performance should never become immunity. Harold nodded slowly. Reasonable. Christopher continued. Condition 2. Anonymous employee feedback must be independently collected twice each year. No department heads may review individual identities. Margaret Sullivan smiled. I've wanted that policy for years. Christopher nodded. So have many employees. He turned to the page. Condition 3. The executive dining room closes permanently. A few directors blinked. One even smiled in confusion. Christopher remained serious. When leadership eats separately, they slowly begin living separately. Nathaniel looked around the table. I support all 3. Harold spoke next. So do I. One by one, every director agreed, unanimously. Christopher closed his notebook. Then I accept. Harold slid the agreement across the polished walnut table. Christopher signed quietly. No applause followed. No photographs. No press conference. Just signatures. Exactly how he preferred it. After the meeting ended, Harold asked Christopher to remain. The other directors gradually left. Only Harold Nathaniel and Christopher remained. Harold opened another folder. There is something you should see. Inside was a printed email, dated nearly 4 months earlier. The sender was Ethan Brooks. The recipient was Abigail. Christopher read silently. Abigail. The executive gala is mandatory this year. You should definitely bring your husband. The board loves seeing family participation. It'll help your visibility with senior leadership. There was another sentence, one that Ethan had deleted before forwarding the invitation officially, fortunately. The company's email archive preserved every draft. The deleted sentence read, "Besides watching your maintenance guy husband mingle with executives should be entertaining." Christopher read the line twice, then placed the paper back on the table. Nathaniel watched him carefully. "You understand why I wanted you to see it?" Christopher nodded once. "So he planned it?" Harold answered quietly, "It appears that way." Christopher remained silent, not angry, simply thoughtful. Nathaniel finally asked, "What are you thinking?" Christopher looked out the conference room window. "I'm thinking..." That humiliation usually begins long before the audience arrives. Harold slowly nodded. Laura Bennett entered moments later carrying another folder. "The investigation is complete." She placed the report before the board chairman. Harold opened the executive summary. 38 documented witness interviews, 126 supporting documents, emails, meeting notes, performance reviews, audio recordings, anonymous complaints, everything independently verified. Laura spoke calmly. "Our findings conclude repeated patterns of workplace humiliation, intimidation, retaliation, and abuse of authority." She paused. "The evidence is overwhelming." Harold closed the report. "Were any findings connected to Mr. Hernandez?" Laura nodded. "Indirectly." She held up Ethan's deleted email. "The gala incident was not spontaneous. It was encouraged." Nathaniel slowly exhaled. Even he had hoped Ethan's behavior had simply been reckless. Instead, it had been intentional. Christopher looked toward Laura. "What happens now?" she answered without emotion. "Company policy. Nothing more. Nothing less." By noon, the official decisions had been delivered. Ethan Brooks's employment was terminated for documented misconduct. 3 additional managers received disciplinary action and mandatory retraining. Several departmental procedures were rewritten immediately. Anonymous reporting systems became permanent. Leadership evaluations became mandatory. Christopher's 3 conditions had already begun reshaping the company. Across the building, employees gathered quietly near computer screens as the internal announcement appeared. No sensational language. No public humiliation. Only facts, evidence, policy, process. Justice without spectacle. That afternoon, Abigail sat alone in her office. She read the announcement twice, then a third time. Her office door opened gently. Monica Reynolds stepped inside. "It's over." Abigail nodded. "I know." Monica sat across from her. "I wanted to ask something." "What?" "Will you stay?" Abigail looked confused. "At Redwood." She looked toward the window. "I don't know." Monica smiled gently. "Then don't answer today." She stood. "But whatever you decide, I hope it isn't based on embarrassment." Abigail understood immediately. She had spent years making decisions based on appearances. She wouldn't make that mistake again. That evening, Christopher remained in the new advisory office Nathaniel had insisted he use. It was smaller than most executive offices. Christopher had requested that specifically. The first thing he removed was the oversized executive desk. Maintenance replaced it with a simple rectangular work table. The expensive artwork disappeared. Instead, he asked that framed photographs of Redwood employees working in factories, laboratories, and customer service centers be displayed. Nathaniel walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You've redecorated already?" Christopher smiled. "I removed distractions." Nathaniel looked around. "This doesn't look like an executive office." Christopher laughed softly. "It isn't." "What is it?" Christopher answered without hesitation. "A place where people can tell the truth." Nathaniel handed him a coffee. "I think that's exactly what Redwood needed." Christopher looked through the glass wall overlooking the city. Employees moved between departments below. Ordinary people, building ordinary careers, trusting leadership to treat them fairly. The office felt quiet, peaceful, useful. Exactly the environment Christopher preferred. His phone vibrated. A message from Abigail. "Would you like to have dinner somewhere tonight?" "Just us." Christopher looked at the screen for several seconds. Then he typed only 4 words. "I'd like that very much." As he slipped the phone back into his pocket, Harold appeared at the doorway. "You've changed this company in 48 hours." Christopher shook his head. "No." He looked toward the employees below. "The people here changed it. They just needed someone willing to listen." Harold smiled. "Perhaps." "But tomorrow," he paused, "you'll discover just how many lives you've already changed." Christopher looked at him curiously. "What happens tomorrow?" Harold smiled without answering. "Someone asked to meet you. And I think it's a conversation you've been waiting years to have." Wednesday morning began without headlines. Christopher appreciated that. No television crews waited outside his home. No reporters followed his truck. No photographers lingered near Redwood's headquarters. The most meaningful changes rarely announced themselves with noise. They simply became visible through ordinary moments. Christopher arrived at Redwood shortly after 8. The receptionist smiled. "Good morning, Mr. Hernandez." He smiled back. "Good morning, Emily." She looked pleasantly surprised. "You remembered my name?" Christopher shrugged lightly. "You introduced yourself yesterday." She laughed. "Most executives don't," Christopher answered as he waited for the elevator. "I'm not most executives." The elevator doors opened. As they closed again, Emily found herself smiling. It was a small interaction, the kind that rarely appeared in annual reports. Yet those moments slowly shaped the culture of a workplace. Christopher believed that more than any management theory. When he entered his office, Harold Whitmore was already waiting. "So," Christopher smiled. "You said someone wanted to see me." Harold nodded. "They're in conference room 3. Christopher walked down the quiet hallway. The conference room door stood slightly open. Inside sat a young woman in her late 20s. Dark brown hair, navy blazer, nervous hands folded tightly together. She stood immediately. "Mr. Hernandez." Christopher recognized her after only a moment. "Lily Carter." She smiled with relief. "You remember me?" "Of course." 5 years earlier, Lily had been a junior process analyst at one of Orion Manufacturing's smallest facilities in Indiana. Back then, she had almost resigned. Christopher had spent 2 afternoons helping her redesign a failing production workflow. She had done the hard work. He had simply asked better questions. "I heard you were here." Christopher gestured toward the chairs. "Please sit." She remained standing for another moment. "I didn't come to talk about work." Christopher waited quietly. She took a slow breath. "My father died 3 months ago." "I'm sorry." She nodded. "Thank you." She opened her purse and carefully removed an old notebook. Its corners were worn. Several pages were marked with colorful tabs. "You gave this to me." Christopher looked at it. He remembered immediately. A plain notebook. Nothing expensive. Inside, he had written only one sentence. "Every difficult problem becomes smaller after you write down the truth." Lily smiled through tears. "I carried this notebook everywhere." Christopher remained silent. My father was sick. My marriage almost collapsed. I thought about quitting more than once. She gently touched the notebook. Every time, I started by writing the truth. She laughed softly. I don't even know if you remember saying it. Christopher smiled. I do? She looked directly at him. I was promoted yesterday. Director of Operations. Christopher's eyes brightened. Congratulations. I wanted you to hear it from me. She paused. You changed my career. Christopher shook his head. No. I helped. You changed it. Lily smiled. I knew you'd say that. She reached into her purse again. This time she removed a small, framed photograph. It showed an entire manufacturing team standing outside a renovated factory. At the center stood Lily. Behind her were nearly 200 employees. She handed the frame to Christopher. We wanted you to have this. He studied the picture carefully. Everyone looked proud. Not because a company had grown, because people had grown. Christopher looked at the handwritten message on the back. You taught us to solve problems without forgetting people. Thank you. He didn't speak for several seconds. Some gifts deserved silence before words. Finally, he looked up. This belongs in my office. Lily smiled. I hoped you'd say that. After she left, Christopher placed the photograph on the bookshelf behind his desk. Not in the center. Simply where he could see it every morning. Nathaniel entered a few minutes later carrying coffee. I passed Lily in the hallway. Christopher nodded. She looks confident. She is. Nathaniel noticed the framed photograph. I've never seen that. It arrived today. Nathaniel studied it. That's worth more than every award Redwood has ever given. Christopher smiled. I agree. Late that afternoon, Abigail arrived at Redwood, not as an employee, as Christopher's wife. She stepped into his office carrying 2 paper bags from a neighborhood deli. I brought lunch. Christopher looked at the clock. It's almost 3. I know. You forgot. He laughed quietly. I did. She unpacked sandwiches onto the conference table. No executive lunch, no catered meals, just turkey sandwiches, soup, and iced tea. Exactly the sort of lunch Christopher preferred. As they ate, Abigail looked around the office. It's smaller than Ethan's office used to be. Christopher nodded. It is. You could have chosen the corner office. I could have. You didn't. Christopher smiled. I already have windows. She laughed. She understood now. He genuinely meant it. After lunch, Abigail reached into her handbag. I have something. She placed an envelope before him. Christopher looked at it curiously. What is it? My resignation. He frowned. You resigned. She nodded slowly. This morning. Christopher remained quiet. She continued. I wasn't forced. I wasn't investigated. I simply realized. She looked around the office. I've spent too many years chasing positions instead of purpose. Christopher listened carefully. I accepted another job. He looked surprised. You did? She smiled. A non-profit organization in Chicago. They help women returning to work after domestic abuse. Christopher studied her face. She looked peaceful. Not excited, peaceful. The salary is much lower. I know. The title isn't impressive. I know. She reached across the table and gently took his hand. But for the first time in years, I'm choosing something because it matters. Not because it looks important. Christopher smiled. I think you will be very good. She laughed. You really believe that? I do. Why? Because now you're listening. Those 4 words meant more than any compliment. That evening, they drove home together in Christopher's old truck. Chicago's skyline slowly disappeared behind them. The setting sun painted the highway in shades of gold and amber. Neither rushed the conversation. Neither felt the need to fill every silence. At a red light, Abigail suddenly smiled. "What?" Christopher asked. "I just realized something." "What?" "I spent years hoping people would admire me." She looked at him. "You spent years making yourself useful." Christopher shrugged. "They're different goals." "They are." She squeezed his hand. "I finally understand." When they arrived home, Christopher walked toward the mailbox. Among the ordinary bills and advertisements was one handwritten envelope, no return address. Inside was a short note. "Mr. Hernandez, I worked under Ethan Brooks for 4 years. I was one of the anonymous employees. I wanted to quit many times. After what happened at the gala, I finally believed someone would listen. Because of that, I stayed long enough to tell the truth. Thank you for remaining calm when anger would have been easier. You reminded us that dignity doesn't need to shout." Christopher folded the note carefully. He didn't know the writer's name. He probably never would. And that was perfectly fine. He carried the note inside, placed it beside Lily's photograph. 2 reminders, one of growth, one of courage. Later that night, Christopher and Abigail sat together on the back porch. The autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves. Neighborhood lights flickered on one by one. Abigail rested her head gently against his shoulder. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally, she whispered, "Do you forgive me?" Christopher looked across the quiet backyard. Forgiveness had never been a single decision. It had been growing quietly since the moment she chose honesty over excuses. He took her hand. "I already started." A tear slipped down her cheek. "I don't deserve that." Christopher smiled softly. "None of us earns grace. We choose it." The porch light glowed warmly behind them. The house looked exactly as it always had. The old truck still sat in the driveway. Christopher still wore ordinary clothes. Nothing about his life appeared extraordinary from the outside. But appearances had never told the real story. The man everyone once dismissed had never needed revenge to prove his worth. He needed only patience, truth, and the quiet confidence to let character speak louder than status. Some victories echo through applause. The ones that matter most arrive in silence. Every life eventually gives us a moment when appearances and truth collide. Christopher's story reminds us that real strength is rarely loud. The people who carry the greatest wisdom often feel no need to announce it, and the people who deserve the most respect are usually the ones who treat others with dignity when no one is watching. Titles can impress a room. Expensive clothes can attract attention, and public praise can fade overnight. But integrity, patience, humility, and consistency leave a mark that lasts far longer. In the end, Christopher didn't win because he embarrassed those who underestimated him. He won because he never allowed their behavior to change the kind of man he chose to be. Justice came through facts, character, and time, not through anger or revenge. Perhaps this story isn't really about boardrooms, CEOs, or corporate success. Perhaps it's about the quiet choices we all make every day. Do we judge people by what they own or by how they treat others? Do we listen to understand or only long enough to respond? And when life gives us the chance to prove someone wrong, do we seek revenge? Or do we simply let the truth speak for itself? Those are the decisions that shape not only our careers, but also our families, friendships, and the legacy we leave behind. Now I'd love to hear from you. If you were in Christopher's place, would you have stayed as calm as he did? Or would you have confronted everyone at that office party? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to tell us where you're watching from. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Tomorrow we'll bring you another unforgettable story that proves character is the one thing no one can take away from you.